But this time the hawk realized this pigeon, and they went up and up and up. And then pigeons have a lot of loose feathers, and there was a huge puff of white feathers as the goshawk grabbed it and then parachuted down to the ground.
Hey, welcome back again, everyone, for another episode of the Falconry Told podcast. And this series, brought to you all by the Cape Falconry Club, is down to the last final couple of episodes. We're in a couple of bonus episodes with a couple guys from the UK that were in attendance, but I just want to say thank you again to the Cape Falconry Club for the invitation and helping to organize all of this. Without them, none of this would have happened, and I appreciate the invitation and the trust to help bring their stories out to the wider world, and it'll always be very much appreciated, and I hope I can make it back again sometime soon. But also a big shout out to the Falconry Heritage Trust for helping to sponsor the travel expenses that were involved with this trip. Without being able to pay for the airfare and without the help that they provided and all that kind of stuff, I wouldn't have been able to make it over there. So big thanks to them. If you want to find out more information on what they do and their mission to preserve the cultural heritage of falconry around the world, just head to falconryheritage.org. And of course, also a big shout out to Bobby Yaga Crafts for their continued support. He makes great quality handmade equipment. If you haven't had a chance to check it out yet, I highly recommend you do so. Just hit him up at Bobby Yaga Goshawk on Instagram, or you can also find the other contact information for them on our website at falconrytold.com. And our guest for this episode, Robert Kenward, has done a lot over the years to help falconers contribute to conservation. He's done a lot of volunteering with the IAF and a lot of work with the IUCN to continue to help with the conservation effort, and he's done a lot of studies of predation by raptors and things like that over the years as well. It was nice getting a chance to talk to him and get to know him some at the joint IAF and IUCN conference and also at the Cape Falconry Club meet, and it was also interesting getting a chance to hear about some of his travel experiences with goshawks and things of that nature through Europe as well. So I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to this conversation with Robert Kenward. I hope you enjoy, and stay tuned for the next episode, which will wrap our Cape Falconry Club series. So appreciate it, and here we go. So you said, when we were talking the other day, you said this was like your, I don't know, second or third time being in this area?
It's my second time being in South Africa.
Yeah.
But I've been in Namibia before.
Okay.
And but not for so much for falconry purposes. Actually, come to think of it, it's my third time in South Africa. Yeah, because I was here for a World Working Group on Birds of Prey meeting in Johannesburg in 1998. Yeah. And so, yes, it's my third time. I came here and went to the Raptor Research Foundation meeting in Skukuza in 2019 because Adrian had asked me to give a paper on the conservation role of falconry. So I did that at that meeting. And there were a number of us gathered there, including Neil Deacon and Yanis Siliki and a few others. So
nice. Well, like I said, this is, I don't know, it's been kind of an eye-opening experience for me so far anyway. You know, it's been, I mean, we have been kind of talking amongst ourselves some about, you know, all the kind of subtle differences between, you know, how falconry is, you know, done in our respective countries and things. And, you know, like I said, as as it continues to just pour outside, you know, it gives us a lot of time to kind of sit and reflect and socialize a little bit. So, you know, as far as this trip goes, though, I mean, do you feel like you've been able to kind of accomplish what you set out to do on this trip, or?
Yes, I'm given the two presentations that I've given, and here's an extra one. So, yeah. So that's fine. But I didn't really come here so much to talk about falconry as about falconers, the role of falconers in conservation. And the strategy of falconry which has got them to this point, rather than having been extinguished in 1975, which was what was at that time intended by some people who put a motion to an organization that was then called the International Council for Bird Preservation, and is now called BirdLife International. And a motion was put that falconry should be forbidden globally. And a number of us were involved in getting rid of that motion, or we didn't get rid of it completely. We amended it, and it was, on the whole, not nearly as unfavourable to falconry. At the end of the day, we certainly didn't get a call for a general ban. And since then, falconry has improved its reputation enough to become an intangible cultural heritage of mankind, registered by UNESCO. So I think we've come quite a long way compared to many of the other organizations that are involved with sustainable use activities, in particularly shooting game and so on. I think falconers have done perhaps a little bit better than most, despite being a small minority.
Well, I've been able to talk to some falconers, like in the U.S. especially, that were kind of involved in kind of implementing or helping to implement some of our national regulations. And, you know, of course, we're also involved in a lot of other things that kind of changed kind of how, you know, I guess the face of falconry in a way. You know, there's, you know, I've had the fortunate, ability to be able to talk to, you know, some people also who were kind of instrumental somewhat in the reintroduction of, you know, peregrines and things like that. But I really haven't had a chance to talk to anyone yet who's kind of been involved in trying to, keep things available for, you know, or kind of keep falconry available for the community in a worldwide stage, you know, as far as that goes. So, I mean, if you don't mind, for people that aren't really familiar with the history of all that, I mean, can you go kind of into how that came to be a little bit and what, kind of was done? I can only imagine just the workings of that and all the work that went into that, but...
Well, the International Association of Falconry and Conservation of Birds of Prey was founded in 1968. And that brought together the major European clubs of the day. And they were therefore in a position when falconry came under attack to do more. The situation was a bit different in the US, but things were going on then as well. And there was the founding of Raptor Research Foundation, which of course was an important event. And then the falcon breeding started actually on both sides of the Atlantic at more or less the same time, though the first person to breed falcons was Rentzwaller in 1942, 1943 in Germany. At least the first ones we know historically recorded, because there is quite a few hints coming out of the older literature that birds sometimes bred in mews when they'd been put to molt. So, but the first occasion was then. But by the time 1975 came along, breeding had been developing well in the last 5 years. RF held a survey of this in about 1970. In the UK, we started a journal called Captive Breeding of Diurnal Birds of Prey, and we translated quite a lot of material from the European sources into that, and we also had some material coming in from across the Atlantic, so that by the time we got to 1975, when the pressure had been building up during the pesticide era, and falconers were being blamed for removing the last raptors, because it must be said there had been some very foolish helping themselves to peregrines from eyries in places like Denmark from the last nesting pairs, which was, I think, a mistake, but did in fact put some birds into domestic use for breeding. But that had brought falconry into disrepute, and that was the reason for that legislation, or for that attempt to put a motion together, which was put together but was not adopted as such. We had a lot of help at that time from people from across the Atlantic. Richard Fife, Tom Cade, Morley Nelson, Wayne Nelson, they were all people who engaged with us at that time, and helped. And we were able to put together a showing of the numbers of raptors that have been bred for falconry, not just in numbers, but in the breadth of species. And we're able to make the point that falconers actually, rather than being the problem, were the potential solution. And that was how we managed to turn the tide at that time. The problem didn't go away, and various countries banned falconry. Denmark, Australia, Sweden. Others didn't legalize it at a time when laws were being made to legalize various aspects of hunting, so it became a grey area. But of course, the situation was different in North America, you'll have plenty of people to have said things about that. I'm trying to remember the name of someone who I was involved with at that time in the States, because I paid a number of visits over there, having been invited, in fact, by Kent Carney to join the Raptor Research Foundation. I got invited over to a first meeting in 1978, and I got Jim Greer, that's right. I got to know, and Mark Fuller, of course, who's now at Boise. So I got to know a number of falconers in the States from traveling over there. Clayton White, Joe Murphy, sadly dead now, who were in Salt Lake City. So I got to know a lot of falconers. And in those days, the falconry meetings of NAFA were arranged jointly with the Raptor Research Foundation meetings, so that they followed on, and falconers were very much a part of Raptor Research Foundation. Not so much nowadays, although there's been some interest recently in making sure that falconers are adequately represented at Raptor Research Foundation.
Well, and as far as, kind of some of the different things that have progressed since then, that you've had to deal with and, kind of have been involved with, I mean, like I said, I know it's quite a length of time from, that point until now, but what have been some of the other things that you've had to be a part of to kind of be involved in the advocacy for all of this? I mean, I know there's probably just so much, but...
Well, I served on IAF as research coordinator from that time until 2006, the IAF and NAFA meeting at Kearney that year. And many people contributed along that way. Obviously, an important thing was NAFA joining in the first place. Roger Thacker had some difficulty to persuade NAFA board that it would be a good thing to join IAF. And the numbers of people joining IAF grew considerably during that period. I think we were up to, by that time, 40, 45 clubs. And now, of course, it's double that. It's 90 or so. But of course, that was helped greatly by the high profile given to IAF as a result of the intangible cultural heritage inscription by UNESCO.
Okay. And as far as, what brings you to, South Africa for this particular trip, I mean, can you kind of go a little bit into kind of what has kind of been going on here now that's kind of was responsible for this joint conference and things, just to kind of fill people in a little bit on, kind of what's been going on over the last few days here in South Africa?
Well, to put that again into a longer-term context, falconers were always great innovators, perhaps the elite innovators of conservation. And it was never just the breeding and release techniques, but falconers were heavily involved in the development of radio telemetry, which is a technique I used throughout my research career for raptors. They've gone on innovating over the time, and this, in effect, is the latest innovation in which falconers are involved, which is international multilingual networking for conservation to try and help converge the thinking of people from cultures all over the world through producing material translated into all their languages so that they're seeing exactly the same thing in each case. It's very important to do this because in some countries there has been quite a movement recently away from respect for the West and listening to the West at all. And in fact, things get changed as they are passed around. Disinformation is a very major part of this. And so it was very interesting. The first two sites that we set up, one of which was a raptor site on the Seka falcon, the second most used languages after English were Russian, because the Russians were getting least information translated across to them. Of course, some other languages. This is in Europe, but in other countries, there's been far less exchange of information. Now, this is not a little thing for falconry because it is an understanding of what falconry is really about, which has been promoted by IAF worldwide, that has resulted in some 90 countries being members. It's a huge change which has happened and has been helped obviously by the UNESCO inscription, but this is it's because of this and because of contacts with governments in these countries that falconry has managed to build its reputation, speak about its conservation, convince people about that in governments and the sorts of groups in governments, in environment ministries and elsewhere that sign up to multilateral environmental agreements internationally, and that has protected falconry and enabled it to bloom. I mean, we now have it legalized in Denmark again. We still have to wait for some other countries, but the process now is to get it legal everywhere.
Well, and just kind of, if you don't mind, also talk a little bit about how being involved with all these different things has kind of impacted, your personal falconry throughout the years. I mean, I can only imagine with being involved in all these different things, how much of a juggling act that probably was for you.
If all falconers have to juggle, they have to juggle their passion and family and job. Mm-hmm. Some of them prioritize the falconry and the job, and that often has unfortunate circumstances for them in the end. I've prioritized the conservation work I've been doing and family. And so the last time I flew a hawk was in 95, my last goshawk at that time. I hope to find time to fly a goshawk again before I become too infirm to be able to do so. But I don't know. This is going to depend on how much we manage to bring on the younger successors of us older ones who have done our fair bit and need others to come on and take over from us, so that we can particularly write some of this down. I'm supposed to be writing a book with Adrian Lombard at the moment on falconry and beyond, which would cover this side of it and cover a lot of the history. At the moment, there are some bits written down, odd paragraphs here and there, but bringing them together is not managing to happen.
I can only imagine. Yeah, I mean, and it's a big sacrifice. I mean, I think, you're right. I mean, for right or wrong, everybody kind of prioritizes things differently. And, I think the majority of us try to do the right thing for the right reasons, but it's easy to get lost sometimes in all of this. And, even though that's a long time to give up, personal endeavors. Mm-hmm. So, I commend you for, at least still having the passion to stay kind of involved in this aspect of things, even at the sacrifice of your own hawking.
Well, I get to handle hawks every so often, but not to keep one myself. And since I'm not a true falconer, I'm an ostringer, strictly speaking. And that's really what I want to fly. They're such awkward beasts. I think that's the challenge of goshawks. And as you know, because we've talked about it, we both share an interest in hunting squirrels. So.
Well, and so about what year did you discover? How early on did you discover falconry? Was it a childhood thing or?
I was fascinated in the idea of falconry. I was fascinated by birds. I had an uncle who was a keen ornithologist and a record keeper, the sort of ornithologist that actually collected systematic data. And he encouraged me in that sort of thing. He forbore my penchant for birds nesting when it was still legal to do that. And I read a couple of books. One was The Taming of Genghis by Ronald Stevens, of course, the first person who produced hybrids that we know about, and T.H. White's book, The Goshawk. And these fascinated me, and I set my heart on training a bird eventually. I didn't get the chance till I was 16. And this was partly because there weren't many falconers in those days. This was in the 60s. And I trained my first bird from using mainly two books, a manual of falconry by Mike Woodford and Falconry for You, I think it was called, by Humphrey Ap Evans. And so I my first bird that I trained, I hadn't met another falconer at that time. I did meet, not long afterwards, James Robertson Justice, who was a larger-than-life fellow who lived quite close by, and ran into him in the street in Winchester and said I was a falconer too. Of course, I'm sure he must have had a lot of people coming up to him and doing that. He was quite a serious falconer and a famous film star. A bit like Morley Nelson, actually, come to think of it. But he was a larger-than-life character, and in many films, the Carry On series of films, the comedies, he used to feature in those, but died quite young. But he was a keen falconer and used to fly up on a moor in Scotland and take a lot of grouse. And knew the early people who who'd come back to flying grouse in the UK because, of course, falconry almost vanished in the UK, not completely, but most of what was going on maybe 100 years ago was more around the Salisbury Plain, partridges and so on, rather than the grouse. And there was a group of people post-war, Jeff Pollard, Stephen Frank, James Robertson Justice, who really got the grouse hawking going again with falcons. I shouldn't forget to mention Roger Upton as well, although he was younger than them.
Well, and when I did the series a year ago for the UK and got a chance to talk to a lot of falconers from over there, it was pretty interesting to hear more about the history of falconry in the UK in particular, and just kind of how, the war especially, or the wars, kind of impacted, the clubs there, and, just, the access to lands, and then the just the amount of falconers there were. And I mean, remind me again, where in the UK are you from, or where
I'm from Dorset now. In those days, I was in Hampshire, which is the next door county, so we haven't moved very far. But there weren't James Robertson Justice, like me, lived near Winchester, and I remember we met on one occasion on the street in Winchester. But I really didn't have any falconers to guide me until I moved to Eastbourne. My parents moved to Eastbourne, sold a family farm, very sadly, which was obviously, it would have been nice to have been able to go hawking on a family farm, but about the same time as I got my first hawk that could actually kill things. I had a goshawk and then a male redtail. My father had to sell the farm and he wanted to retire. I was a post-war family. He had a pre-war family as well, so he was getting on a bit. And there I met several falconers. Mike Dawson, who was in charge of the Hawking Club of Great Britain at that time, I got to know. But the first one there I think I met was Bob Sims, who used to fly redtails, and in fact my first male redtail came from him, and he was the first person who got me actually to catch quarry, because it's quite difficult. That's one of the real elements of why it's an intangible cultural heritage, is that you can learn to train hawks, you can fly hawks, fine, get them to come back to you. There's plenty of instruction in the books for that. But the little things like how to find quarry in a place where you're likely to be able to catch it, these sorts of things were at that stage, at least. I mean, there are much better books available now, but at that stage, there wasn't really anything very much to tell you. If you were going to fly falcons, there was, because the books had been written mainly about those. But for short wings, not so much. Certainly you couldn't get much out of T.H. White's goshawk, for example. So there wasn't too much. And to be able to go out with someone and fly a hawk at the same time as them and in turns and catch my first rabbit, that was down to Bob Sims. And Mike Dawson got me into the club world, Hawking Club of Great Britain. I was secretary of that for a while and helped arrange the amalgamation with the British Falconers Club, so that there weren't two competing national clubs, which there were briefly for a while.
Well, and around, do you remember around how old you were or how long you had been practicing falconry when you finally kind of, made your first kills or made your first catches and stuff?
I guess it was about a year after I'd started flying. I had a Brahminy kite, which was imported from India, which was my first bird, which we bought through the equivalent of the internet nowadays, pages in Cage and Avery Birds. And it wasn't a hawk that you could train it, and it used to fly very nicely. lovely, very beautiful acrobatic flights and so on, and it would catch a lure and things, but it was not any good for catching anything. And so the first bird I had, as I mentioned, was the red tail from Bob Sims. And I was at that stage, I must have been about 17. I had the first kite at 16. I passed that on to someone else about having had it for about 9 months, I suppose, and then went on and got the red tail. And I must have been 17 then, probably. And then I started flying goshawks regularly. My first one from Bill Ruddock, Sergeant Bill Ruddock, who introduced the goshawks into the north of England, and he was bringing in birds from Central Europe, some from the Czech Republic, and from countries there. And if they were nice, I think they were mostly probably caught at pheasant pens. If they were nice, he did bring some eyases in. My first bird I had from him was an eyas. But if he was getting haggards in which had been caught, he was letting them go back into the wild. And that established the population in the borders between England and Scotland. Someone else was releasing the birds at the same time in the Welsh borders, which established a population there. Those were coming in from Sweden. And then I was involved in bringing in birds from Finland, and we released them in several other areas as well. But Bill Ruddock and the others were actually more important people for re-establishing the goshawk. We studied it in more detail, but they let the birds go in insufficient numbers to build the populations there.
Well, and about how long of a gap was it before? So you pretty much started flying goshawks or accipiters, kind of right after those early years then?
About 18, I started flying goshawks, yes.
Just never went back after that?
No, I flew goshawks all through my doctoral thesis. My doctoral thesis was about the impact of goshawk predation on wood pigeons, and so that was based partly on arranged attacks and partly on developing methods of following goshawks around with radios on, and if they were eyases, you could bring them back in. You could an eyas goshawk, we've discovered that you could actually pick it up after 10 days out. You had to crawl on your stomach, and I had a hook on an extendable car antenna with which I could hook the Almarai jesses when I got close enough. But it was possible to do that. But the adults, the passengers and haggards, you couldn't. Haggards were instantly wild. You could get them back by putting a narcotic in a kill they'd made, but it was a bit of a dangerous process because the dosage rate to immobilize the bird safely was quite close, we discovered doing this later in Sweden, to the level at which liver damage could occur. So it was a dodgy technique, and we then went over to things like putting noose carpets down and so on. But so I went through my doctoral thesis looking first at arranged flights at pigeons, and then at wild or semi-wild hawks, how they were hunting and what they were doing, what their behavior was like, and so on. And then went on postdoc to look at the same thing in Sweden. So I was probably training goshawks until about 1980. And then I had a break, and then when I was very busy with my research career and traveling quite a lot, and then I got another bird about 1990 and flew that until 1994-5. Must have been just into 95, actually. The end of that winter, and that I then had a buzzard that we thought had crossed naturally with redtail, but probably hadn't briefly after that, but didn't manage to get it to catch anything. You can get them to catch things, but it's quite difficult to do so. The common buzzard is a far cry from a redtail in terms of hunting ability, and so that must have been late 90s, and since when I haven't had a bird myself, but I've been out with plenty of people.
Well, I mean, I'm sure that over the years of you not being able to have a bird yourself, you've kind of at times probably have felt like you needed to scratch the itch occasionally, get your occasional fix,
If you've flown a bird really well, you don't want to fly it half-heartedly again. And during my thesis and during my early career, I was able to fly hawks 3 times a week at least. You've got to keep a goshawk or any bird really to keep it really fit so that you're not taking it below an ideal weight in order to keep it responsive. You've got to keep it really fit, and you've got to fly it enough to do that, and I wasn't able to do that anymore. Also, I mean, I'd flown 10 or so goshawks, and I'd flown them at pretty much everything that was good to fly them at. I hadn't discovered squirrels. That came in the 90s, and that's what I'd like to go back to doing, because that was the most fun of all.
Well, and before we talk about squirrels a little bit, just kind of talk about some of the experiences that you had, kind of trying to learn the best way to hunt a goshawk on some of the original quarry that you tried. I mean, what was the, since I know you said you really hadn't had much in the ways of mentorship, and I mean, when you started flying goshawks, did you, by that point, had you found really anybody that could kind of help guide you at all, or were you still kind of trying to learn a little bit by just experience?
I was still learning pretty much by myself. I took about 15 quarry with the redtail and then lost it in the spring. It one day it was in quite high condition, and it just went up and up and up out of sight. So I got a goshawk after that. I did go to Germany, and I stayed. I hitchhiked around Germany with a goshawk. I used to hitchhike even to the German meetings. Quite fun to do that with a hawk on the fist. You take a newspaper as well that you put down the well of the car so that it could relieve itself without abusing the hospitality of the driver. But I don't know that. I don't remember being taught. I expect I had advice along the way. I met lots of people who were good flying hawks. Jack Mavrocordato was another person at that stage. I used to go out a bit with Gordon Jolly, who was with whom I was joint secretary of the British Falconers Club for a while. But most of it was self-taught. But you come to realize fairly soon that you need to find the species that you want to enter a hawk to in an inconvenienced state. In other words, either where the young ones are, or where they're away from cover or whatever. You learn that fairly quickly. The wood pigeons were quite challenging to get the bird to fly at. People don't normally fly goshawks at wood pigeons, although they take masses of wood pigeons in the wild, so to get them to fly at wood pigeons was a little challenging. It took more than one season. The first season I didn't really get the bird. In fact, the bird refused to take slips at wood pigeon flocks during that first season, and it was only in the second season that I realized that I needed to find places where the young were not long out of the nest, and then particularly find them around the edges of brassica crops, which was not an ideal food for them, and if they were, you used to get weak wood pigeons there, which were easy to catch. catch. Then having got a hawk well into those, it would take long slips at them. And that was how I was able to arrange flights at them. I think we arranged about 100 flights during the course of the season, in which something over 30 resulted in kills. So that was a difficult species to enter to, much more difficult than partridges, pheasants. Rabbits and moorhens were just too embarrassingly easy to catch, and one sort of, after a time, didn't really want to fly at them.
Well, I mean, I have to go back a little bit here real quick. I mean, it's kind of hard to just briefly touch over something like, like hitchhiking with a goshawk too. I have to ask you, I mean, I'm assuming you were probably hooding these birds, right? Like this bird that you had with you at
Do
the
you
time?
know, I can't remember whether I always hooded them. I did hood goshawks eventually, but using the very light Indian hoods. But I don't know that I did, I think they were just very well manned, because I used to virtually live with the things. And one occasion when I trained 2 males, because I wanted to have one and a spare when I was doing the actual flight arranging, it was a lot of work to keep two goshawks flying fit at the time, not least because I virtually lived with them. And so they were pretty tame. And I think, I don't know that I traveled with them, a hood or not. I can't remember. Sadly, no photographs of that. I have 1 or 2 photographs of that age, indicating that my hair was a lot longer than now. But I don't really remember. There are a few photos, but not of me carrying goshawks, only when I was hunting with them, and then they weren't hooded. So I never hooded with them for hunting. I think, I made one of the early traveling boxes too, but I don't think I tended not to hood gozzes. They not take to it brilliantly well. They tend to droop their heads and so on.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I can only imagine what some people's reactions were. I mean, on average, how many rides did you have to?
I don't know. So it's funny. I used to go with a Union Jack, because in those days, Brits, we're talking about the late 60s, early 70s, the Brits had still not made themselves unpopular again in Europe. They were considered pretty popular. So I used to take a small suitcase with a Union Jack over it and a goshawks. Seems a bit silly. But when you got close to the falconry meetings in Germany, you used to get people who were falconers who picked you up. And I remember meeting one of them 2 or 3 years ago, saying, "Do you remember we picked you up before the 73 meeting?"
Boy, that's got to be that had to have been random. Just, geez. Well, that's so funny, and it just, like, once again, I've had this conversation with many people, and, one of the things that is another common denominator in falconry is if there's a will, there's a way. And if you really want to make something happen, and, you generally will figure out a way to do it. And it sounds like you were no exception in a lot of those regards. But no, well, I mean, that's awesome. I can't honestly say that I had heard any hitchhiking in stories with birds and falconry yet, but I'm sure that it's probably happened somewhere else and at some other time. But I mean, so when, as you mentioned earlier, I mean, we had kind of talked in and around, some of the activities over the weekend, but, you mentioned, that you discovered, squirrels, and, you mentioned earlier that you would like to pursue that more seriously again sometime, circumstances and life, permitting. But how did you discover that this was something that you liked doing and, was really fun? Was it kind of like an accidental, catch where your bird would just started pursuing them one day and you just kind of stumbled on to squirrel hawking, or?
Yes, I think I stumbled onto it. It was a bird that we'd been using in research. It had been radio tracked, released and radio tracked, to look at settling behavior, because we'd got a lot of data, masses in Sweden. We'd radio tagged some 350 goshawks there, in the nest, and caught adults. But, what we had was a lot of data on dispersal, but not nearly so much on settling behavior. And we wanted to look at that a bit. And there was an interest in filming the bird too, because it was a bird that had been manned but not entered. And so we had taken it to the stage when the feathers are hard. And in the wild, the birds normally disperse in the 2 to 3 weeks after that point. They start ranging much further from the nest once the feathers are hard. And so we then put this bird out well fed into the wild with some food and hacked it on a fairly not such a soft hack, and it managed absolutely fine, because it found a pheasant pen and started helping itself. Had to catch it in again, used a spring net to do that, which is a much better way of getting the birds, which I'd learnt in Sweden by that time. And that bird was not very keen on flying pheasants afterwards, surprisingly, because although it had taken an awful lot in a short time, it seemed not very keen on them. But it was interested in squirrels. And after we'd had the first one, and I'd learned, maybe a first couple, probably the first one it took on the ground, I don't really remember. But after that, it started flying at them in the canopy, and I realized very quickly that the squirrel's escape route was down the tree, usually in a spiral, dodging around the trunk, and that if you could push the squirrel back up into the tree, and the goshawk learned, as she did fairly quickly, that the name of the game was to stay up in the canopy, then eventually it would break through the small branches. And so it was a great participatory sport. You had to get there and be engaged and help and prevent the squirrel getting away in the undergrowth on the ground. So there's a great fun, real cooperation between hawk and falconer, which is what makes the most fun, I think, in falconry. And I'd like to do that again, because there's some ideas that we have about possibly getting birds from game farms and doing exactly what I did with this bird. She became really keen on squirrels, and she wasn't very keen on pheasants. And I'm wondering whether we could get birds that are trapped at game farms and train them to take squirrels and let them go again. Also, possibly using aversive chemicals, of which there are some, to deter them from eating pheasants, to make them really unkeen on pheasant. It would be an interesting thing for falconers to do as another contribution to conservation, if you like. But whether we'll get round to that, I don't know, because the networking is much too important for now, and because it is building the links between IUCN, the World Conservation Organization, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and IAF. And that's very important for IAF, and it's bringing together scientists and falconers as practitioners, particularly young falconers, because the youth side of IAF is so well organized. And to organize networking from global to local level in this way is something which no other conservation groups have tried. They probably will copy us and follow it, but at the moment we have the lead with this, and that's of great importance for our reputation in the future, if only for showing that we continue to innovate. But it gives us a responsibility. It's also great fun for the young falconers and brings them in contact with governments and all sorts of things, which is practically good for the future falconers. So I'm not allowing myself another goz until we've got this off the ground.
Well, and just to clarify too, I know I had asked you about this the other day as well, but it is mainly gray squirrels that you had over there, right?
That's right. Where I am, I'm hunting gray squirrels. You could not hunt red squirrels. Red squirrels are protected, and you'd need a license if you wanted to hunt them, but I wouldn't want to hunt them anyway. So, having worked research on both species, the greys are more of a challenge than red squirrels anyway. Because they're bigger and more boisterous, and you need a bird that can handle them properly.
Well, great. Yeah, well, I mean, for what it's worth, I hope that you can wrap up whatever duties you feel like you need to wrap up so you can go back to enjoying squirrel hawking again, someday in the near future. It's, like I said, it's something that I've come to really enjoy myself. So, I mean, I get it, for sure. But, well, I think this would be a good time to go ahead and get, at least one or, two memorable stories if you can. Like, what are a couple of the more, or just one in particular, whatever comes to mind, of your favorite hawking stories, or, what sticks out in your mind as a memorable experience that you've had in the field with some of the birds that you've flown?
Well, I would not want to claim it for my own birds. I think the most memorable flight I ever saw was at spowing plover in Argentina at the international falconry meet there. IAF had a meeting there, and we went out into the field, and I think it was an Aplomado falcon. It may not have been. I cannot remember precisely, but that flight went on and on forever. And the plovers are, of course, very agile and can dodge a stooping falcon. And that bird dodged for a very long time until it was tired. It was almost like playing a fish, because when it was tired enough, the falcon brought it down about 15 meters in front of the falconer, who was able to get there quickly, which is quite important because those birds, the spurs on those birds, can do some damage. And that flight I will never forget.
And is there any particular, flight that of birds that, you have flown that, I guess I'm assuming that it was probably, maybe one of the early birds that you flew that probably, made the most impact on you. But, I mean, what's one of the more memorable stories for one of the birds that you've flown yourself?
The most spectacular flight I can remember was when we had, because we were working on wood pigeons and we needed marked wood pigeons as well, we'd been catching wood pigeons by putting bait down with alpha chlorose and a barbiturate in it on the grain, and the pigeons would eat this, and then they would go into a drugged state, and you could go and pick them up. And we'd caught a lot of pigeons like this and tagged them. And the particular field where I was doing this, we thought we'd sort of turned the remaining grain over into the ground so that it was not accessible to any birds. But I came up to it with a gauze on the fist, and I noticed there were some pigeons there. And since I was quite close and the bird was taking slips, I flew the pigeons. One of them was a bit slower than the others, and it was clear to me that it must have got a little of that grain, but it went up and up and up. But the hawk knew that it was not quite right. And of course, they would give up quite quickly with a wood pigeon, because the flight speed of a wood pigeon is several miles an hour faster than a flat-out goshawk. So once they attack them, if sitting on the ground eating or on the brassicas, they would give up. They wouldn't bother to follow through on it. But this time the hawk realized this pigeon, and they went up and up and up. And then pigeons have a lot of loose feathers, and there was a huge puff of white feathers as the goshawk grabbed it and then parachuted down to the ground. And I thought, my word, that is not the sort of flight you could deliberately arrange. It would be unethical to do so, but as an accident, that was an amazing flight.
That's awesome. Well, like I said, I think that, that's probably, a pretty good note to, come close to ending on here, but I would like to do like I have been doing for a while now with a lot of our guests. And I'd like to ask you, what piece of advice or what sentiment would you like to leave to, current and even prospective falconers? And, what do you think is an important piece of advice for people that are either wanting to get into the sport or are currently in the sport?
Well, falconers are patient, usually, anyway, because it's difficult. But patience is the most important thing. And the reason I say this is because it's a bit of advice that I've frequently given to falconers, not so much for training their birds, but for legalizing falconry in other countries, because you need to wait until you have established your conservation credentials in each country before you can really ask the conservation authorities to consider making you illegal. Too many places people have been in too much of a hurry, sometimes wanting to breed and sell birds for some reason or other things. And my advice has again and again been patience, and unfortunately that advice isn't always taken, and then that's a generational wait usually once someone has got upset. So in terms of the politics as well as in the immediate training of the birds, you need a lot of patience.
Well, that's definitely something that, along with a lot of the other piece of advice that we collected, it's definitely something that it can't be said enough. So, like I said, I appreciate you, being willing to do this and, to, kind of share some of your stories and experiences. And I mean, just out of curiosity, for any of the younger generation now who's thinking about wanting to get more involved in a lot of the things that you have, the type of, the political side or just the conservation side of things, and, they don't really know where to begin, to get into that. I mean, what would be your advice to them on like the best method to kind of maybe get involved in some of these things?
We really need them. Get in touch with IAF, and Julian Müller is the person to get in touch with. He speaks 3 languages, Spanish, English, and German. And get in touch with IAF. There are lots of young falconers there. They're all involved in the networking. If we don't get on with the networking, which is about restoring habitats, restoring prey species, and restoring biodiversity in general, then there won't be anything for us to fly at in the long run, and the numbers of wild birds of prey will diminish too. So if you don't want to be wind up flying robotic prey, possibly eventually with robotic falcons, do get in touch with IAF and help with the networking and the translation and the outreach to farmers and people to help them improve the ecosystems which they manage, so that we can keep hawking into the future. We want to build up the numbers of prey, not to see that decline anymore.
Perfect. Well, thank you for sharing that as well. And, unless you can think of anything else that would be noteworthy to give to a worldwide platform here before you're ready to call this good, like I said, thank you again for, joining us and, for taking the time. It's not like we're missing out on a whole lot today, I guess, but, thanks for helping me make the most of, staying productive, I guess, during another monsoony day here. And, like I said, thanks again. It's been great meeting you over the last few days.
Thanks very much for leading me so nicely through the interview.
No problem, Robert. Well, I appreciate you.